Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
One of the stories I've been covering over the past 5 years has been the sexual abuse-related stories of the Duggar family, who was the evangelical family that starred in the TLC series 19 Kids and Counting. In 2021, I wrote a piece titled The Weakness of Complementarian Theology on Display in Duggar Trial about their oldest son, Josh Duggar, being arrested and charged with receiving and possessing child sexual abuse material. He was eventually found guilty and is in the middle of serving a prison sentence until 2032. Then in 2023, I wrote a piece titled How to Connect the Dots While Watching Shiny Happy People. It was about the first season of the Amazon Prime docuseries that focused on the Duggar family. In that piece, I did a deep dive into Bill Gothard's Institute and Basic Life Principles that the Duggar family followed and promoted, and shared how some of those same theologies and ethics appear in mainstream evangelicalism today. Now this week, Josh's younger brother Joseph was arrested and charged with molesting a 9-year-old girl. And given the fear and control and history of abuse we all knew the Duggars had related to sex, it wasn't surprising to hear this news. But then Joseph's wife, Kendra, was arrested on 4 counts of endangering the welfare of a minor and 4 counts of false imprisonment. Joseph has also been charged with those same 4 charges as well. So while hearing this news isn't surprising, it can be very triggering for abuse survivors. Not only are you reminded of your own trauma, but you're reminded of the ever-looming presence of the world you escaped. One woman who has been very helpful for survivors processing these things has been Tia Levings. She's the New York Times bestselling author of A Well-Trained Wife and I Belong to Me, and she was on the Shiny Happy People docuseries, so I sat down with her to discuss. In light of the recent news about Joseph Duggar, I went back over the weekend and rewatched season 1 of Shiny Happy People, which you were interviewed for. And one of the things you said in that docuseries was the shiny, happy images are the sugar, and we're all high on it. And I know you were talking about the shiny, happy nature of their culture, but when I heard you say it this time, my mind went to their ultimate reality of the afterlife, because there's a sense in which they're creating hell on earth while projecting an image of heaven here for them, but in the afterlife, they actually think they're going to be experiencing tearless bliss in heaven while their family and friends are experiencing endless violent punishment. So do you think it's fair to connect their view of the afterlife with their power dynamics in this life? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's actually a really cool layer of depth you picked up on. That is embedded into the reason why I escaped and the things that helped me break to the point where I knew I needed to get out back in 2007. Because they do create a hell on earth. And it's also with this pretty sick, when you think about it, parallel of everyone I love is going to go to hell. Anyone who doesn't think like I think is going to go to hell. And they're doing this while abusing and hurting people. So I couldn't reconcile that as a person stuck in it at the time, the misery that was happening in my life was supposed to be preparing me for this tearless bliss, like you call it, but it wasn't even lovely anymore. And yet that was supposed to be the hope that I hung everything on. As long as I could hang in there, I was going to get to heaven. And the inequality of that, situation was just breaking me. So yes, I still think it's that whole prosperity gospel aspect of it, the idealized images that they use in their propaganda, but also the wishful and magical thinking, this idea that they glorify the suffering and that if you just hang in there and you just do these really hard things that make you not even yourself anymore, it'll all be worth it in the end. And eventually I had to call that card. So it does feel like addiction when you're in it.
Yeah, it's like when I was in it, the term we always used was we were living out the gospel. And then once you start to recognize the extent of the abuse in the living out part, at some point you got to question the gospel and
Right.
their understanding of what that even means.
Yeah, that's kind of advanced deconstruction right there. But yeah, it also can get there in a flash, because I probably would not have said that I started this cognitive process of deconstruction with dealing with crucifixion and and like the higher aspects of the gospel. But definitely I started being like, well, why are we glorifying someone's brutal murder as our justification for suffering on the earth? Like the whole substantiary part, really stopped making sense. Um, any justification for suffering on earth. It seemed to me that the Jesus message at its core was about relieving suffering and not maximizing it in a sadomasochistic way. Put some scripture on it and make everybody suffer.
Yeah.
That just didn't sound compatible with Jesus.
Yeah. So another thing that stood out to me rewatching the series, it was really interesting rewatching it after it's been a few years. You kind of like,
Yeah,
I know the people a little bit more that are in it,
right.
and like, you know, you're a little more removed. So,
hmm
yeah, it was kind of interesting. But one of the things that stood out to me was that one woman said Christianity for her became about all the things she couldn't do. And like, there's this all-encompassing nature to the entire movement. Like your entire reality is very walled in. And so I wonder if you could speak some to the trauma of inescapability that this world makes you feel when you're in it.
Yeah, it really is like the frog in the water cliche at this point. It's so gradual and you make step by step. It's formulaic, and I think this is one of the biggest tells that you're in a fundamentalist cult without it being overtly called that, because of course we didn't talk about it that way. We just thought we were following God, being more devout, being more faithful, living our values. We had all these nice ways of saying it, but it was an incremental narrowing of our lives. And then you turn around and you realize, I can't get out. I can't change my mind. I can't even ask a question without getting in trouble. And it does become this litany of things that are prohibited instead of the liberation and love that the gospel is presented as. White fundamentalists really turn that into a prison. Um, in contrast with Black liberation theology, like they're very different ways of looking at Jesus. But that's what we were in was white fundamentalism, and it is don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that, and then you still aren't ever enough. There's never a point where that submission and obedience is enough. You're still scared you're going to lose your salvation. You're still scared you could be left behind. You're still struggling with the outcomes and fruits in your family and not wondering or wondering how can I fix this? And the answer is always more control. So it's a zero sum.
Yeah. How do women and girls experience this inescapability different than men and boys might?
I'm right on a pivot with this point. Because so much of resisting patriarchy means highlighting what this experience is like for women and girls,
Hmm.
and it kind of invites the binary that the men are always the bad guy. And I know from my experience, something that's been very heavy with me the entire time is that everybody suffers under this model. The men are not healthier or better off. They aren't always pushed into that binary. That's not always a comfortable fit for them, and they do resist it. And they try to be partners who love their wives and fathers who love their children. And they also are oppressed by this message that men are only acceptable if they have this one expression of masculinity. Um, so yes, I mean, the labor force and the oppression and the abuse and the subjugation is most evident with women and children, but that extends to men too. It's only been recently that I've seen this as a talking point is how obedient beta men can be. This is very evident on the right now because they will fall in line with the authoritarian leader so quickly, and people are like, "How can Pete Hegseth be like a lick boy? Like how can he do that?" And it's like that's the ruse, right? Like this is not a tribe of alpha men. This is an authoritarian model with a vertical power structure, one or two men on top. Everyone else gets under in line. And while men might be a little higher than women, they are not autonomous people with senses of self and full ranges of their emotional capacity. It's not a healthy development for them either.
Yeah, I remember like when I was in these churches, because the authorities with the pastors, and so you may have a half dozen pastors for a megachurch, but
hmm
then you've got like a thousand men submitting to six men.
Right.
Or like when I was at Bob Jones, my parents were on staff there, and they had a handbook for the faculty, and like that that like determined what I could listen to, what I could watch, what I could wear while cutting the grass in my own front yard. And there was like one point where I told my dad, I was like, Dad, like like this is again, I was still operating with the assumption that my dad should be the leader of the home. I was like,
Right.
you're supposed to be the leader of the home, but like all you are is like the enforcer for whatever their rules are.
Oh, yes, perceptive child you were. Gosh, calling them on their hypocrisy, like, and it's right there. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So a lot of people who grew up in that fundamentalist IBLP world or like a Doug Wilson world, they'll
Mhm.
recognize some of the ways they were harmed, like I did at that time, but then they'll leave and go to a more mainstream conservative evangelical community church that feels more open and free.
Mhm.
But like then as I look back at it now, like we still held to the same theology, the same hierarchies that the fundamentalist world had. It
Mhm.
was like slightly different presentations of the same thing. And so, like, you hear about these Doug Wilson people calling their husbands my lord, and that
Mhm.
sounds so extreme. And we'd be like, oh, well, we're not like that. But like, we'd essentially still have to treat the husbands as if they're the Lord.
Mhm.
And so, and like, I often hear evangelicals say, well, if you were in an extreme situation, but if you were to my church, everything would be totally fine. So, like, how do you suggest we address the more overt abuses that catch people's attention with the
Mhm.
Gothards and the Wilsons in a way that doesn't lead them to dismiss mainstream evangelicalism?
Oh, I talk about in this often. It's nuanced, right? So, better by degrees is not necessarily better. That's first. I used to really push back against people who would come into the space and say, not all Christians are like this. And I would say, of course they're not. I'm not here to cheerlead the people who are getting it right. I'm here to expose abuse, and someone who's doing it right shouldn't have a problem with that. The fact that you're more interested in defending the reputation of an organization than siding with survivors is telling. And I changed that like recently. Now I'm like, go tell them because the only criteria for Christianity is to say you're a Christian, to believe. And they believe they are Christians just like everyone else. And so it is on the job of these other churches to clean their house and do their own policing of their own heretics. It's not the job of secular society to decide who is really a Christian. So when we have a situation like that, where we have a church that's like better by degrees, not quite extreme, I still want to point out the patterns. Glennon Doyle makes a really good point. Look to see who they allow to lead. If they truly claim to be different, do they have different kind of leadership? Are there women pastors? How do they have gay Sunday school teachers? That kind of a thing. Like, there's that proof will be in the pudding that, that real progress will show up. And then, like, honestly, what I find is most people who spend a lot of time in the progressive space find that's not a fit either because of those very patterns. So then just being like really supportive about people who want to be private with their process or keep a fluidity in their deconstruction or not assign new labels to their belief, not belong to groups that require belief in order to have membership and belonging. There's a lot of ways to divest from that, but I think it is a process of discovery.
Yeah. Last night, CNN had a docuseries that they finally, or a documentary that they finally released after a couple delays about Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And it was pretty funny hearing them interview Doug Wilson and asking him some like completely over the top sexist like question, and then he's just like, "Yes, I believe that." Like
Right.
so to the point. And then you hear these they would talk to some of the women as well that were had been hurt in this world. And like so I appreciated the documentary from that
Mhm.
point of view as far as like exposing some of this, but then they made a point that this is just a few, like not all conservative Christians are like this. It's really just a small minority. And I was just like, is it really? Because they're still promoting the same theologies and hierarchies.
Right. Yeah. And it's our Secretary of War. I still call him the
Yeah.
Defense Secretary. They're in Washington. I mean, I personally, with my platform, combat that message. I understand why CNN wanted to remain balanced and not like be alarmist, but I think we should be alarmed, and I think we should really pay attention to this demographic. If it's most evangelicals who believe these kinds of doctrines, then it is in, the majority of the Trump administration, which is the dominant, governing force right now. I don't think they're the majority of the country. And I do think there are a lot of faiths and sects that are not, affiliated with it, but they are not, again, doing this job of policing Christian nationalists. So, I just keep spreading awareness. My segment on that aired separately. It was a more of a preview piece on the reality of tradwife life, and um, that's what I rule with is the real experience and the reality check of survivors. Like their ideologies, like he feels emboldened to be as blatant as he wants to be now, but this is the first time in history that survivors have been, right next to him, and they're right there online, and anybody can Google what is it really like to live in a Doug Wilson church,
Mm,
and they will find survivors like me. Like, and my friends at deconstruction doulas, and all these, our whole movement.
yeah. So one time I was mentioning online about how harmful conservative theology is,
Mhm.
and there was this Doug Wilson lover that came on and commented and said, he said, I never think about if my theology is harmful. I only ask if it's biblical.
Oh,
And I thought that was really an insightful
it
confession.
is.
Because like there was one moment in the Duggar season of Shiny Happy People where they were talking about the IBLP's law of crying out.
Mm,
And they said, in the handbook, it said, God has established some very strict guidelines of responsibility for a woman who is attacked. She is to cry out for help. The victim who fails to do this is equally guilty with the attacker. And it quoted Deuteronomy 20:22, talking about stoning a woman if she doesn't cry out. And it's like that's just so messed up. And I'm not just talking about their interpretation of the Bible, like I'm talking about what the Bible actually says is messed
mm.
up in that situation. And so I'm wondering if you've noticed like the role that biblical inerrancy plays in creating these abusive dynamics today.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest ties between a more Baptist Protestant movement of IBLP, Bill Gothard, very, very Baptist dominant, even though he was non-denominational. And then Doug Wilson, who is Reformed Presbyterian and has his own, covenant Reformed evangelical denomination that he had to form himself so he could go be a renegade. Biblical inerrancy is the thing. The difference there is that Wilson's a theonomist who believes in the reestablishment of Old Testament law. So his biblical focus is on a book like Deuteronomy. And so they would be cohorts completely in this situation. It's definitely not trauma informed, and that's why it feels so messed up because there's a lot of ways women or victims respond to um, sexual trauma or any other kind of abuse, and crying out assumes that they have faculty of their senses, that they're not dissociated, stuck in freeze, that they're safe enough to cry out, that they will be believed if they do. Like we have a whole Believe Women campaign for a reason because people don't believe women and people who cry out. This idea that you're co-responsible with your assailant, that keeps women trapped in abuse. That kept me trapped in abuse for a very long time because I had that booklet on my shelf and I read that and studied it and prayed over it and realized that I was equally responsible for the violence in my home. And the irony is that to an extent I was because I needed to leave. As long as I stayed there, I was allowing myself to remain in the path. I didn't know I had the agency, and a lot of times I didn't have the agency to leave. So it was unnecessarily shaming, and that is really a higher discovery of complicity, and that comes much further down the road. In the instant, in the moment, like no, the victim does not share responsibility with that, but that is a very convenient narrative for those who want to um, use this bypassing tactic. You'll also hear them say, well, we've all sinned and come fallen short of the glory of God. Everybody's sinned. Everybody's guilty. Everybody's, you really can't point out Trump's sin because, you've sinned too, And so it's just another bypassing technique, but that biblical inerrancy is they think the hill they die on. And if you have a broader worldview, once you get out of the high control and you realize there are many ways to interpret some of this, this is an old book that, there are other ways of being and other ways of interpreting scripture and other ways of living without scripture. And that there's reasons why our legal code isn't supposed to be, Christian, one religion. There's all kinds of counter arguments for this. And so apologists like that person who gets on there and defends, he thinks he's got the gotcha. Like, I don't care if it's harmful, it's biblical. Um, and it's not the flex he thinks it is. The Bible is full of X-rated content that doesn't apply to a more modern society. And if, you believe in a living organic God, um, a God that supports evolution of being and civilization and, growth and health and healing and the fruits of the spirit, which are also in the Bible. Those are not compatible,
Yeah, they never begin with the Sermon on the Mount or the fruit of the Spirit. They always
right?
talk about Deuteronomy and the conquest narratives and then
There's
say
a
the same
reason.
God then is the same God today.
Yeah.
So, speaking of bringing all this forward to today,
Hmm.
so you have these stories like the Duggar story that are constantly popping up. So that's one thing. We also have these Gothard and Wilson dynamics that are being taken to the federal government. And then we're also having a lot of scandals recently. Even just saw another one this weekend where in the progressive Christian or ex-evangelical world, where influencers, religious trauma coaches, or even therapists continue to cause harm. And so it's like this, while we were in the world, it felt very inescapable.
Hmm.
And then now that we leave that world, it's like it's following us and it still feels so inescapable. And so, like, how can those of us who survived these hierarchies of abuse be aware of the harm that's continuing to happen around us while also caring for our own feeling of helplessness when we're constantly bombarded with new stories?
I think this is a great question. Also, I want to validate that feeling that it follows us. That's because of where we're at. I don't think that's true in the wider sense of our human lives and our experience. I think what we're living through is their strategy hit critical mass to come for our country. And so if we left anywhere, before or during the early Trump administration, yes, it followed us because it came for our country. It's why I'm in this work. It's why a lot of my colleagues are in this work. We could see this scaling up. And so it's not perception, but it's also very reflective of um, where we're at politically and that it can still be defeated. And I think I personally believe in an optimistic view of the future. I call it a protopia. It's progressive. It values research and science and health and overcoming and reclamation. It's not utopia, not perfect. And it's also not dystopian. And so I look for ways to be, I can do this with my boundaries, instead of I can't all the time. That's a direct flip of the narrative, because I don't want to double down on control in recovery. I want to stay open. I look for ways to carve spaces that are completely religious baggage free. So that means sometimes really stepping out of my wheelhouse or genre. What am I reading? Can I find something that doesn't have any religious undertones? Or can I stay in a very reframed religious space? Right now I'm kind of fascinated with the romanticy genre because there's a religious pipeline. There's a pipeline from religious trauma to romance, and they solve they explore these things that were once you can't do this, you can't do that, that kind of thing. Um, my second book, I Belong to Me, is a lot about rediscovering your sense of self after indoctrination because indoctrination interferes with self-development and child development. So there are many stages that we should have had as teenagers and as children that skipped. We just skipped it. We didn't exercise these muscles or grow these muscles, but we can still do them in adulthood. So I'm very adamant that that story I lived through does not get to be the whole of my life. It can't do much about the fact that it's my past. I have a lot of say and power in how much of my future it gets. And it's a big part of my present right now because I'm protecting that future. So it comes down to practical steps for me. I actually did not watch the special on CNN last night because I had some panic symptoms in my body. And so I took care of my nervous system, regulated, knew there was no urgency attached to this. I can watch it on the app the next day, and I went to bed. And today I'm able to focus this, with some regulation and clarity again. So it's things like that, being very self-aware in my body, aware of what's happening. What am I always going to be struggling with because of what I lived through? Caring for my inner parts and my inner children and my, stories that I carry in my body. Um, and then just a lot of grace on younger me and present me and, solidarity with fellow survivors is a big one. I was just noticing today that there's an entire category and bookshelf now on deconstruction books and, people who have left the movement. That didn't exist 10 years ago. And we did that. Your book's going to join that. Like we have a whole section now, like, and survivors coming out of this have options and resources for support that just never existed before. I think that's really exciting.
Yeah. You mentioned the stages of development that we skipped in childhood.
Yes.
they're also, those are stages that we're going through now. And that's one of the things I've appreciated about your work is that you have a sensitivity to people who are on different stages within that journey now of like coming into touch with the wonders of their childhood and healing the
Mhm.
wounds that they experienced in those times. So I appreciate all the work you're doing, and I appreciate you coming on here and sharing your thoughts with us.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.